Okay, so in the programmes it says that Gillian Einstein was going to be presenting this with me, and although that was originally the intention, she's detained in Linköping with some of her responsibilities there. So although she contributed a lot to the development of the ideas in this, this is sort of, I'm presenting this as a solo author with some sort of supervision from her. So my intention, before I start properly, I just want to say if I go too quickly, then wave at me and I'll slow down, because I am a very fast talker and there's a lot of words to fit into 15 minutes.
We actually have time, we're going to be early.
Okay, then I'll speak slowly and...
So miracles happen.
Miracles do happen, okay. So my intention in this presentation is to use a feminist approach to neuroscience to deconstruct in a new and subject-specific way the dominant norms of gender, and in so doing, to develop and critique the current construction of trans in medical and socio-political discourses. And I'd like to begin with a couple of quotations to help understand some context of where I'm coming from philosophically. So first we have Wittgenstein saying, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world," which was referenced in several, not the specific quote, but the concept that language constrains the way that we can talk about identities as trans people, particularly those who violate binary assumptions. And Judith Butler, everyone's favourite, saying, "Sex is thus not simply what one has or a static description of what one is. It will be one of the norms by which the one becomes viable at all, that which qualifies a body for life within the domain of cultural intelligibility." Oh no, wrong button, sorry. Using these insights into the delimitation of cultural concepts of gender and exemplified by the restrictive structure of gender within language, I want to argue that viewing gender as binary leads to a collection of microaggressions that collectively enact a violence against each person's body. I'll achieve this by comparing two main cultural practices that are often used in ensuring that gender conforms to this binary view: Western transitional medicine and female genital circumcision, mutilation, cutting. There are many names for it, but I will refer to it as FGC. In doing this, I'm going to reconstruct transition as a social process of coming out as one's gender and a radical act of personal and political autonomy, but one which is often distorted by the social process of the gender binary, creating or exacerbating dysphorias, which in turn call for biomedical intervention. I hope that some of the ideas emerging from this line of thinking will enable the behavioural and medical sciences, as well as the social discourses that they influence, to begin to recognise the intertwined nature of social processes with nervous system development. I also hope that this short presentation will be able to demonstrate the value of a feminist epistemology of science, because that approach is the basis of all of the ideas that I'm presenting today. So, I think we can all agree that gender norms are historical and socio-culturally based. But the contents of the social world influence every aspect of our lives, including our bodies. One demonstration of this comes from cultures in North Africa that practice FGC as a way of instantiating gender. Abu Sharaf interviewed Sudanese women, one of whom described her experience of a clitorectomy, or the removal of the clitoris, as follows: "Circumcision is what makes one a woman, because by removing the clitoris, there is no way her genitals will look like a man's." The willingness to take such measures to define and restrict gender demonstrates its perceived importance in these, and indeed most, if not all, human cultures. It's important to note that these may seem like an extreme solution to us as Westerners, but we too enforce gender on the body. One strikingly similar instance is the mostly Western practice of surgically altering intersex infants' genitals to make them conform to a binary construction of sex. Human beings have a strong tendency to categorise, and gender isn't an exception. Because there are a majority who are able to fit, albeit probably in most cases inauthentically to some degree, into one of the two gender boxes of male and female, or man and woman, only those two are permitted, and refusal to conform to them will be punished harshly, and many of us here can probably attest to that. And this echoes Butler's point about cultural intelligibility. But these ways of enforcing a gender binary create hurt and damage in many. Just as there is hurt and resentment in the intersex community, and an enforcement of binaries on people who wish to violate those systems of thought. There are also negative views about FGC among women who have it. Maria Karimji writes about her personal experience of FGM in an autobiographical essay entitled Damage. And it's very long and very good, and I recommend that you read it in full. But one sentence that really speaks to what I'm getting at here is when she says that she told her grandmother, "I told my grandmother that FGM had ruined my life." In a somewhat similar sense to that in which Karimji felt that the use of surgery to instantiate gender upon her body was a mutilation that had ruined her life, there are also many trans people who prefer not to undergo surgery, despite often feeling pressure from others to do so. These variations in perceptions between all three groups upon which a binary is enforced in this way are doubtless related to the specificities in their own lives, including their culture and their experience of that culture. What is similar, though, is the almost culturally ubiquitous societal enforcement of gender binaries. I don't want to suggest, because I don't think it's true, that physiological findings like the correlation between gender identity and the experience of phantom genitals is somehow just a pure product of social conditioning. But what I want to say is that the distress that these experiences create for trans people may be being exacerbated or even created by social conditioning. So the desire to constrain gender embodiment into one of two categories can be seen throughout Western culture in the three cornerstone beliefs of cisgenderism. Firstly, that in a state of natural good health, the human body, including the brain, is sexed in a dichotomous way that has only two forms. Secondly, that the sex of the body is directly equivalent to the gender. And thirdly, that the external characteristics of sex, especially the genitals, are the sole signifiers of both sex and gender, and that gender is therefore also binary. I would contend that this social process is the primary site of violence in all of these examples of partially or fully coerced gender instantiating surgeries. So, at this point, I'd like to talk a little bit about the processes that I envisage going on behind dysphoria. So, we have a gender identity, wherever the hell that comes from, and we have an assigned gender, and we all know where that comes from. And these things filter through the perceptions of ourselves, our self-perception, or other people's perceptions of us, and then social expectations of us, creating explicit social learning. You know, you're a good boy for playing football, you're a bad girl for playing football, or whatever. Maybe less stereotypical parents would be different, but and then the gender identity coming from a different direction. You unconsciously categorize others as similar or dissimilar to yourself. It's called the like-me hypothesis, and the idea is that you observe other people and draw conclusions about how similar they are to you, and based on those conclusions, you imitate them and internalize their behaviors as your own behaviors to a greater or lesser extent, which leads to an implicit process of social learning. And the consequence of these two contradictory processes of being told on the one hand, this is how to be a boy, by the way you're a boy, and this is how to be a girl, but you're not a girl, but you know that you're a girl, or whatever else it is. These two contradictory processes create that sense of dysphoria, which just starts out as a sort of kernel of conflict between two ways of thinking. So I think to relate this back to the embodiment aspect, I think the social dysphoria, which comes from perceiving other people perceiving one differently to how one perceives oneself, that's a lot of ones, that can in turn exacerbate the embodied dysphoria, the sense of looking in the mirror and seeing something that doesn't match up with your identity, which in turn can feed into a proprioceptive, or some people might call it somatosensory dysphoria, which is where your internal body maps and the shape of your body are not the same as one another. And these kinds of processes, I don't propose, as I said already, I don't propose that any of these things exist purely because of social conditioning, but rather that they exist as a product of the relationship between internal self-descriptions, which may well be in large part socially created as well, and externally imposed ideas about what gender means for bodies, and therefore what gender the subject is. So, drawing on a feminist philosophy of science, Jill Einstein, who would have been my co-presenter, she focused particularly on Elizabeth Gross and used Gross's work to study women with FGC. And her study highlighted the omnidirectional interplay between society and the embodied self. For example, showing how pain and sensitivity to touch became uncoupled in some of the women with FGC, specifically those who had perceived it as instantiating gender. Now, at this point, there's a really important distinction that we need to make, and that is the degree and form of consent. Neither intersex infants nor the majority of women who experience FGC are in a position to consent or dissent to the bodily modification when it happens. Trans people, on the other hand, whose desires for their embodiment are often constructed in the popular imaginary as running contrary to normal gender expression, as opposed to having these treatments forced upon us, we're all too often made to fight against an unsympathetic legal and or healthcare system to gain access to those treatments. But even for trans individuals, there is an aspect of non-consent, even where a legal transition isn't contingent on specific medical interventions, which is embedded in having to conform to whatever degree to an all-pervasive gender binary. This becomes especially apparent in the instances of those of us whose treatment desires, or needs, really, are, to a greater or lesser extent, incompatible with the binarist model of gender that pervades institutional medicine. In these cases, we come strongly up against the binary model, which leaves us unintelligible even to our gender specialist clinicians, and consequently the uphill battle seems to be steeper. This restriction of bodily autonomy is interdependent with the physical transition being medicalised. In DSM-4, it constructs it as being partially correcting the mind by changing the body. And so there is a direct pathologization of a trans identity as an inherently disordered way of being. And then in DSM-5, which is by no means perfect, but it is a vast improvement, constructs the physical transition as treating a pathological distress that arises from the incongruence between gender identity and the body's morphology. Now, I would argue that incongruence, and I actually think that the authors of the DSM are kind of implying this, but not wanting to say it out loud, that the incongruence isn't really between the identity and the body, so much as the identity and the social constructs imposed upon bodies of one's own type, if that makes sense. Does that make sense? So, while we've moved away from pathologizing trans in and of itself, society's focus on the binary leaves little space in which to fit one's identity and continues to determine clinical practice. For example, there are no surgical options for people who seek ambiguously sexed genital formations. So far, non-binary bodily presentations just really aren't on the table. The clinicians need only to omit to raise the possibility of a non-binary presentation and identity, which, let's be honest, I think we all know most of them actually avoid doing, for the dominant narrative of gender as binary to lead to an indirect pressure to undertake a binary sex presentation rather than a physical transition that might better suit the patient's identity. It might be worth considering what would be a possible form of physical transition that was not binary. At the moment, the only real example I can think of that's remotely prevalent is trans men having top but not bottom surgery. But the issue with saying, oh, therefore we've got non-binary bodies in the world is, based on that, is that picking some things from each of two columns is not the same thing as not having columns. So it still doesn't really leave room for a fully authentic presentation of a complex gender identity. There may well be reasonable clinical arguments in favour of a certain degree of pro-binarism in consulting and advising transgender patients, simply to provide, a la the Butlerian notion mentioned earlier, a cultural intelligibility which might help to alleviate the distress that defines social gender dysphoria. But at the moment, we're not in a place where clinicians or institutions are seeking to give us the freedom to choose how binary we want to be in order to cope, but rather trying to force us to be binary in order to leave them comfortable. Those of us here who are trans will know that it is often necessary to pass as one of the binary genders in order to alleviate social dysphoria. Not necessarily as a cis member of the gender to which we identify, or most identify out of the binary, but as a member of that gender nonetheless. And this is illustrated really beautifully by this webcomic, in which a little trans girl is explaining how she needs to conform to some stereotypes in order to be culturally intelligible. I'm not going to leave it up now because you'll be reading it and not listening to me, but I'll come back to it later. A gender that is neither female nor male is likely to be culturally unintelligible. So it poses a very real social challenge, because how can one be understood as a gender that most people have never before imagined? So the only short-term solution, at least, is to try to find a comfortable state that optimally meets the dual needs to be authentic and to be comprehensible. This falls short of many trans people's ideal concept of a transition process as a kind of coming out or self-disclosure and self-determination, a social first approach with very few assumptions about bodies or binaries attached. There remains a focus on genital surgery as the basis of gender transitions, rather than the act of coming out, of self-identification as a particular gender, binary or not. This distraction seems also to lie central to objections raised by certain groups of feminists against transgender identities and discourses, where they often perceive medical and particularly surgical components in transition as being born out of a belief in the equivalency between genitals and gender, rather than being part of a way of performing gender in defiance of social norms that is no more intrinsically harmful than, say, makeup, and as compared to makeup, has a lot to offer the process of degendering social roles, which I would like to think, at least, is a fundamental objective of both feminists and trans activists, which are probably mostly the same people, I hope. Furthermore, this focus on surgery may in turn reinforce transphobia in society's gender discourses, as well as in our own internalized dysphoria and transphobia, playing on the idea that trans people are fundamentally an inauthentic facsimile. And it's hard to say for two reasons. An inauthentic facsimile to the gender with which we identify. This in turn generates social dysphoria and focuses that dysphoria on the genitals until they become the focus. If only my body matched what people expect from a man, woman, something that other people don't expect anything from at all, then I will feel real, then I will be able to have a normal life. So this might propel many trans people who otherwise might be entirely happy presenting their authentic gender with little or no medical intervention into undergoing major surgery. One possible interpretation of this is that the social environment has, as Einstein puts it, written on the corporeal body, which includes the brain, until the genitals themselves, despite having no physical changes at the peripheral level, but rather at the level of the central nervous system, become pathologically misshapen, even while their shape is unchanged. So for a majority, this writing on happens during early as well as later life, and thus by the time the majority of trans people are coming out, their wish to change their genitals that have become the focus of their dysphoria, and consequently their need for genital surgery, has been present for some time, albeit hidden, possibly even from themselves. Only after all of this indirect societal coercion do trans people begin to seek the very thing into which some of them may have been coerced and which binarizes their gender. Thus, like with FGC, there are those people who have been moved by society into wanting something, and those who would have desired it regardless, and a majority for whom the one has enhanced or exacerbated the other. While a focus on solely biological explanations of gender and trans identities is not always helpful, and often appeals to a binary conception of neurodevelopment, the sexual differentiation of the brain may well have significant influences on genital body maps, so trans people's body maps are likely to be in some sense different from the cisgender members of their assigned sex. As I've mentioned, one mechanism behind this may be the myriad of social processes that could affect these maps through an embodied dysphoria, probably at least as much as the processes in utero and in early childhood. It should be pointed out, though, that most of what we know about the maps in the somatosensory cortex is based almost exclusively on studies conducted in adult men, and I would like to spend time whinging about that and why it happened, but I don't have time.
You're +5 already, but you should have been.
Okay, sorry. So in order to optimise the outcomes for trans people's health and healthcare, as well as tackling the reinforcement of binary gender identities and the barely concealed violence of public expressions of transphobia, we need to begin to engage with the issue that trans identities, along with most other gender identities, may not fit easily or accurately into binary categories. Whenever surgery or any other biomedical intervention is going to be done, there need to be options chosen by the individual that support their own perception of their body, rather than trying to fit into a predetermined mould. This isn't to say that other people's perceptions aren't a valid reason for somebody to choose a particular treatment, but rather that choices should be contextualised within the needs of the individual who is seeking it, as independently of the influence of the cisgender gaze as possible. At present, the medical model of gender dysphoria places an emphasis on a binary transition that is incompatible with the intrinsically personal and polyspectral nature of gender, especially gender as experienced from outside the cisgender privilege bias. Removing the emphasis on passing and binary transition may be the best way to optimise the clinical outcomes following a particular decision. One size really doesn't fit everybody. I'm nearly there. Bringing the social and the biological together as a way of understanding the influence of society upon neuronal circuits will have profound effects for considerations of the ethical issues surrounding the treatment of trans people. It highlights how society's addiction to the binary might generate or exacerbate gender dysphoria. If our bodies are being changed within and through the nervous system by society's desire to enforce a binary, bodily autonomy is actually being denied. On one view, the social processes that have enhanced or at times created the necessity for clinical treatments. The DSM-5 itself gives a nod to this when it hints that trans people's distress at the incongruity between their gender and other people's expectations about gendered embodiment may well be a rational response to an irrational world.